Dr. Joanna Wharton. Again, Joanna's bio is in the catalogue and the programme. Joanna is a research associate at the University of York Centre for 18th Century Studies. Her first book, Material Enlightenment, Women Writers and the Science of the Mind, shows how influential women, including Anne Letizia Barbald and Maria Edgeworth, adapted and applied philosophical theories in the writing to transform education culture and make substantial interventions in the social reformist politics of Romantic Britain and Ireland. So I'd ask Joanne. It's just incidental that we're always experimenting with the Edgeworth philosophies and one thing here and another in Edgeworthstown. And last night we had a film, The Requiem for the Big House, which probably the Edgeworths suffered from as well. But there were two people there, and they're working on an experiment that we know nothing about, but just informed us last night that Richard Lovell Edgeworth sent a message from the lawn of his garden here in Edgeworthstown to the lawn, a telegraphic message from Edgeworthstown to Tullinally Castle. And they're independently, nothing to do with us as such at the moment, but they're independently working on this, and they hope to replicate that during the summer. So things are happening out there all the time that we don't know. So now I introduce you to Dr. Joanna Wharton.
Yeah. Okay, hi everyone. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you so much to the Edgeworth Society for the invitation. So just a slight caveat, my paper isn't really going to talk so much about practical education itself. Instead, it looks to either side of it. So its early development and its later influence in the field of psychology. So my work is sort of in between literary history and history of science, which is why Matt was mentioning the telegraph there. That's something that I also work on. Okay, so to begin, here are two extracts, each taken from notebooks in which a parent has recorded observations of their children. The first step says that on April the 2nd, a child named Doddy used a bit of stick as a lever to break a doll. On March 26th, 1842, at the age of 2 years and 3 months, Doddy was generous enough to give Annie the last mouthful of his gingerbread. And today, the 27th, he again put his last crumb on the sofa for Annie to run to, and then cried in a rather vainglorious tone, "Oh, kind Doddy, kind Doddy." And the second extract reads, a child of 3.5 years old, seeing her sisters taken care of and nursed with sore feet, though they suffered a great deal of pain and uneasiness, said she wished she had sore feet. A child of 2.5 years old, when her bonnet was putting on to go out walking, of which she was very fond, looked at the cat and said in a plaintive manner, "Poor pussy, you have no bonnet, pussy." So I don't know how many of you will recognise these, but the first extract here is by Charles Darwin. Dolly was his son William, and Annie was Darwin's baby daughter. The second extract here is by Honora Edgeworth, Richard Lovell Edgeworth's second wife. The children were her stepdaughter Anne and her daughter, also named Honora. So although these observations, both Darwin's and Honora Edgeworth's, might seem, at first glance perhaps, to hold more personal than scientific value, both parents are interested in how and when children develop certain traits, such as sympathy. Both seem to be amused as well by their children's verbal expressions. So Doddy speaking in a vainglorious tone, and Honora's namesake clearly thinking it's a crying shame that the cat is going bonnetless. So I hope you'll be able to see here that there are some similarities between these two texts. But it probably won't come as any surprise that there's a huge discrepancy in the historical attention that's been paid to them. So for obvious reasons, really, much more has been written about Darwin's observations of his children and his contributions to the study of child development. By contrast, Edgeworth remains a really marginal, Honora Edgeworth, remains a really marginal figure in the history of that science. And in fact, what Honora, her husband Richard Lovell, and her stepdaughter Maria were doing has not actually usually been considered as science at all. It's more often looked at by literary scholars than by historians of science. And this is the case even though, in their own words, practical education owed its existence to Honora's opinion that the art of education should be considered as an experimental science, and that many authors of great abilities had taken their road by following theory instead of practice. On the right of the slide here is a medallion Richard Lovell Edgeworth commissioned from his friend Josiah Wedgwood after Honora Edgeworth's death from tuberculosis in 1780, just 2 years after she began writing her child observations. And the medallion is a reminder of the ties between the Edgeworths, the Wedgwoods, and the Darwins. Charles Darwin, of course, was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, a great friend of Richard Lovell Edgeworth and an important influence on practical education. The Wedgwoods and the Darwins were intermarried across generations. Charles Darwin was married to Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin. And Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, and Richard Lovell Edgeworth were all, of course, members of the Birmingham Lunar Circle, a group of industrialist innovators in the English West Midlands. And this is prior to the Edgeworths settling in Edgeworthstown in 1782. Anyway, given this background, it's possible, I think, that Charles Darwin knew about Honora Edgeworth's notes on child development. We do know for sure that he read Practical Education because his papers include a brief abstract of its theory of sympathy. So before going any further, it's probably a good idea to address the problem of anachronism when talking about the Edgeworths and child psychology. The first recorded use in English of the word psychology to mean the study of mind was by David Hartley, philosopher, and he was an important influence on Richard Lovell Edgeworth via Joseph Priestley, another member of the Birmingham Lunar Circle. And Joseph Priestley published his abridged version of Hartley's theory of human mind in 1775. I'm going to return to Hartley and Priestley later, but for now, the important point is that although the word psychology did exist in the English language much earlier, it only came into widespread use in the second half of the 19th century, and I'm not aware of the Edgeworths ever having used it. Just as a further indication of the rise of psychology as a discipline in Britain, the Psychological Society wasn't founded until the first decade of the 20th century. So clearly, then anachronism is a potential problem for my argument. And a useful summary of this problem is Andrew Cunningham's analogy, where he compares the intentional pursuit of scientific knowledge to playing a game. If someone's playing a particular game, Cunningham says, then this game is what he means to play. It's what he knows he's playing. So it's intentional, in other words. And he has to have a concept of it to be able to engage in playing it. One cannot be playing a game by accident, nor can one sensibly be credited with playing one game when one is in fact playing another game. Game's not like that because intentional activities are not like that. And he goes on to say that it doesn't matter how good you are at playing the game. That's irrelevant. So under this argument, historians of psychology should really limit themselves to the study of psychology only in the case that it was called psychology and followed the same rules. This is a very strong position to take against presentism, I suppose, so the projection of values, beliefs, and attitudes from the present onto the past. And since Cunningham wrote this in 1988, historians and philosophers of science have criticised his stance, for good reason, I think. So the problem really is that it leads to a very rigid separation between past and present, and ignores the ways that historical ideas and practices continue to influence present-day science. But Cunningham's more general point that the activities of historical agents should be considered within their own historical contexts and with their own intentions in mind does make sense. So this is just to make it clear that what I'm not saying that the Edgeworths' experimental science of education actually was child psychology. They didn't know the game, so they simply couldn't have been playing it. What I am saying is that practical education does have a place in the history or the prehistory of that discipline. I think it has an important place, and one that hasn't really been fully recognised. So this brings us to the question of what the Edgeworths themselves thought they were doing when they were observing the children and taking their notes. In the appendix to Practical Education, where some of Honora's notes are reproduced alongside Maria's, the authors offer an apology for including such trifling minutiae, but they justify the inclusion of the notes by implying that Honora had actually anticipated and begun to carry out an idea that the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid later proposed, and this was the idea to create what he called a distinct and full history of a child's cognitive development. According to Reid, such a, and I quote, treasure of natural history would probably give more light into the human faculty than all the systems of philosophers from the beginning of the world. So with this appeal to Reid's common sense philosophy, the Edgeworths again prioritise experiment and experience over metaphysical speculation or theory. So practice, again, is what they're emphasising here. But they're wary, even so, of inflating the significance of the data that they presented. So they're reproducing these notes of child observations, but they're worried that people will think that these are just trivial and silly details. But even so, they really hope to think that that doing so would help fledgling science to take off as a wider movement. And they wrote, perhaps even this slight attempt may awaken the attention of persons equal to the undertaking. If able preceptors and parents would pursue a similar plan, we might in time hope to obtain a full history of the infant mind. So they're calling for other parents and teachers to emulate Honora's child observations. So had the attempts to chart the development of a child's mind actually been replicated in due course in the years following the publication of Practical Education, then I think Honora's notes might have been considered as formative in the emergence of a distinct field of study. But it would be half a century before Charles Darwin began taking notes of his son, for which he's been hailed as the founding father of developmental psychology. Others have claimed that Darwin's work was the earliest empirical study of child development by an English author. I think it's clear, though, that an earlier example exists in Practical Education, albeit by Anglo-Irish rather than English authors. I should also say that they weren't the only people doing this at the time. There were kind of earlier, well, at around the same time, there were other empirical studies on the continent, such as Dietrich Tiedeman's Observations on the Development of the Mental Faculties in Children, which was published in Germany in 1787. And interestingly, Tiedemann, like the Edgeworths, called for a large-scale effort among parents to enable comparison and generalisation. So this is all really to say that practical education should, in my view, be taken seriously by historians of science. Recognising the book as a pioneering, empirically based study works against mistaken notions of Ireland as peripheral to scientific development in this period. It's also important, I think, because it adjusts perceptions of women's historical involvement in the sciences. History of psychology rarely bears testament to the work of 18th century women, even though there's evidence that their work influenced 19th century evolutionary psychologists. So one example of this is James Sully, who was a founding member of the British Association for Child Study and the British Psychological Society. And he cites Maria Edgeworth several times in his 1884 textbook, Outlines of Psychology, and he directs his readers to her chapters in practical education on attention, on memory and sympathy. And then in 1886, Sully's Handbook of Psychology for Teachers cites Edgeworth 24 times. 24 times. By comparison, Darwin receives 5 citations. Here's just a short extract from Sully's handbook. Everyone knows the difference between a plodding child able to concentrate his mind on an object for a long period, but slow to transfer and adjust his attention to new matter, and the quick but rather superficial child, the volatile genius, according to Miss Edgeworth, who finds it easy to direct his attention to new objects, though hard to keep it fixed for a prolonged period. So the assertion that attention varies amongst children, it underscores the need for educators to adapt their teaching methods to suit individual needs. By recognising that some children excel at prolonged focus while others thrive in quick transitions to new material, educators can tailor their approach to best serve each child's capacity. And this child-centeredness, as we might call it, is something that both Edgeworth and Sully have in common. So it's worth pointing out that Sully was friends with Charles Darwin. In 1893, Sully published an appeal to parents asking them to send him first-hand observations carried out on children during the first 5 or 6 years of life. And it's been claimed that Darwin's child observations were the inspiration for this. But Sully was also friends with Francis Isidro Edgeworth, Maria's half-brother, and he clearly had a great respect for practical education. Sully's works went through many editions into the 20th century. So remarkably, practical education continued to be a resource for psychologists, at least for Anglophone psychologists, for over a century after its publication, and possibly in other languages as well. I mean, I haven't really looked into psychology, child psychology on the continent, but since practical education was translated into French and any other languages, German isn't certainly French. Yeah. Maybe, yes, later. So perhaps there was also an influence on the continent, and there is I think there is also some similarity between Piaget's educational psychology and Edgeworth's ideas. So as well as this obvious influence, the Edgeworths seem to have anticipated some of the ethical and methodological challenges of the discipline. In its explanation of the methods they employed in child observation, practical education, to me, seems genuinely ahead of its time. It may occur to parents, they say, that writing notes of the remarks of children would lessen their freedom and simplicity in conversation. This would certainly be the case if care were not taken to prevent the pupils from thinking of the notebook. The following notes were never seen by the children who are mentioned in them, although it was in general known in the family that such notes were taken. The particular remarks that were written down were never known to the pupils, nor was any curiosity excited upon this subject. The attempt would have been immediately abandoned if we had perceived that it produced any bad consequences. So this might be considered as an early formulation of what's known to modern psychology as the observer effect, the phenomenon where the presence or awareness of an observer can influence the behaviour or responses of the individual being observed. It certainly suggests a level of rigour in the Edgeworths' note-taking practices. They also considered the ethics of publication and the right of the child to self-determination and anonymity. The anecdotes included in practical education were read to the children before the book was published, and their names don't appear anywhere in the text. The limitations of their study also receive some consideration, and they concede that complete objectivity towards the children was impossible, and a degree of partiality or bias was inevitable. We hope that candid and intelligent parents will pardon if they have discovered any desire in us to exhibit our pupils. We may mistake our own motives, and we do not pretend to be perfectly impartial judges upon this occasion. So, keeping in mind the Edgeworth suggestion here of the challenge of separating parental affection from empirical study, I want to turn now to Honora Edgeworth's notes and their place in the development of practical education. Inevitably, perhaps, given the collaborative nature of the project, it involved different and sometimes competing beliefs about education. And one of the points that I want to make is that there is an occasional tension between Honora's opinion that the art of education should be considered as an experimental science, and her husband, Richard Lovell Edgeworth's own partiality, really, to theory. At a more general level, I want to ask, if we consider practical education as a pre-disciplinary study in child psychology, or as part of the history of that discipline, then what can it tell us about the social and cultural construction of ideas about child development and about the child's place in that process? Ultimately, I suggest that Honora Edgeworth's notebooks and their use in practical education highlights a lasting problem, that the analysis of children's behaviour is prone, and behaviour and also their intelligence or capacities, I suppose, is prone to subjective perceptions, norms and biases. And this isn't to say that there isn't truth or value in them, or to take an anti-science view, but rather to bring attention to the potential risks of what we might call scientific dogmatism. Okay, to Honora's notes on education. As a work of collection, Honora Edgeworth's notebooks contain a miscellany of observations on the behaviour and idiosyncrasies of the children. They're made up of anecdotes, short conversations between siblings and conversational lessons with their mother or their father, occasional strictures on education, and often quite comical, nonsensical, or sometimes affecting instances of the children's speech. They don't follow any discernible system, chronological or otherwise, and they certainly don't seem, at first glance anyway, to resemble scientific documents, what comes across most strongly instead is Honora's affection for and pride in her children. So here's one example. On the 27th of November 1778, Anna and Honora, 5½ and 4½, began to spell in Mrs. Barbauld's little book. On that day fortnight, a piece of paper with some raisins sealed up in it was given to each of them, and these words written on the outside: "Open this and eat what you find in it." They had no assistance, and in 20 minutes, Honora read it without making any mistake. So Honora records the methodology, the duration, and the results of an experiment in the teaching of literacy. Her use of Anna Letitia Barbauld's highly influential lessons for children and the reward of raisins helped to situate these practices within kind of a broader educational culture of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on instruction with delight. But the entry also attests to the emotional dimensions of such a milestone. So I think we can just detect the author's pride, and particularly in her namesake's achievement. So this entry was actually used in the chapter on tasks in practical education, but in the published version, there were 2 alterations. So firstly, it adds that the words on the paper were marked according to our alphabet, and that was referring to an engraving of a phonetic chart that was included in practical education. And secondly, in the published version of events, both children successfully completed the challenge. So I think what they're trying to do there really is to kind of balance out, or make at least the children appear to be achieving this milestone together, so that there's less sort of obvious maybe partiality. So these embellishments really might seem to have sort of little consequence, but I think they're a useful example of Honora's work being adjusted or reframed for inclusion in the book. So perhaps the most revealing of Honora's notes, or the most revealing of her own thinking, is this one, which appears in practical education, but again, there are some slight alterations in the published version. Honora writes that she's observed that there are periods as long as 2 or 3 months at a time in the lives of young children wherein their bodies appear remarkably active and vigorous, and their minds dull and inanimate, incapable of comprehending any new idea, and forgetful of those they have already received. As this extraordinary bodily exertion subsides, they betray much restlessness and disdain for their usual plays. The intervals between meals appear long to them, they ask a multitude of questions, and they're continually looking forward to some future good. If at this time any employment be presented to them, they receive it with the utmost avidity, pursue it with assiduity, and their minds appear to have acquired additional powers from having remained for a considerable time inactive. So the mind and the body seem to be more kind of interested in physical play, and then that can go on for months, and then that subsides, and then their mind seems to become more active. So the recommendation in practical education that bodily exercise should immediately follow periods of focused attention might bear some relation to Honora's observations on the shifting interests of children. And it also makes a common sense case for variety in lessons. But the chapter in practical education on the subject of attention marks a distinct turn towards quite a more sort of medicalised view. Dr. Darwin, and this is Erasmus Darwin, of course, Dr. Darwin observes that when we experience any disagreeable sensations, we endeavour to procure ourselves temporary relief by motions of those muscles and limbs which are most habitually obedient to our will. This observation extends to mental as well as bodily pain. Thus, persons in violent grief wring their hands and convulse their countenances. Those who are subject to the petty but acute miseries of false shame endeavour to relieve themselves by awkward gestures and continual motions. Now, practical education dispenses a preventative and a cure for what they call a habitual awkward gesture that's associated with attention. So kind of tics that people develop when they're concentrating. So they say that when a child is attending to something such as a book, they have to be entirely still, and the parent should watch for, quote, the first symptom of any awkward trick. If children have already developed an association between the contortions of their bodies and attention, then it's necessary to cure them either by a total suspension of all the employments with which these habits are associated, or by sudden slight bodily pain. And then when the child next shows an interest in learning, they have to remain completely still. So that's how to stop children from kind of these awkward tricks associated with attention. But for Honora, as we've seen, I think the sort of ebb and flow of a child's attention was really quite a mysterious process. It was an involuntary physiological process that demanded patience and the careful timing of lessons. And she never really theorised attention beyond this, other than remarking that, quote, the playthings of children should be calculated to fix their attention so they may not get a habit of doing anything in a listless, inattentive manner. So Richard Lovell Edgeworth, on the other hand, he did, I think, give quite serious and sustained consideration to attention. And the key question for him was how to command, direct, and fix the child's attention. So attention is the foundation, really, for them, for all learning. So how to kind of control, how to make a child pay attention during lessons was really a big question for him. And the answer for him was primarily, I think, to be found in David Hartley's doctrine of association. So I mentioned Hartley and Priestley earlier. So Hartley's theory of association, very, very briefly, was he proposed that ideas and sensations become associated in the mind through repetition of their co-occurrence. And that these associations form the basis of all mental processes. So basically, human subjectivity, human minds were formed through habitual associations. Is what he called them. Sometime around or soon after 1780, Richard Lovell Edgeworth sent to Joseph Priestley the first practical education, not the work we're discussing today, but an earlier text, Practical Education, or The History of Harry and Lucy, a book for children that was written by Honora in collaboration with her husband. Along with the book, which was never published, only privately printed, he sent a letter in which he praises Priestley's edition of Hartley's theory and gives the reason for his own application of it. So before that book, before Hartley's theory had fallen into my hands, I had been able to form the temper of my children to good humour and good nature, but I couldn't pretend to form their characters with any degree of precision. The doctrine of association struck me the moment I had learned it as the true foundation of universal education, and everything that had formerly appeared to me unaccountable and anomalous resolved itself at once into this comprehensive theory. I now endeavoured to associate pleasurable sensations with whatever I wanted my children to pursue, and pain with what I wished them to avoid. I was able to proceed with a degree of certainty that exceeded my most sanguine expectations. So, as you might know, this wasn't the first educational theory that inspired Richard Lovell Edgeworth. He'd educated his first son, Richard, on the basis of Rousseau's Emile, and that was an experiment that really it disappointed him in his results. Education along associationist lines was almost the exact opposite. Rather than letting nature do the work, the instilling of habits, particularly habits of attention and obedience, they began to take precedence. And for Richard Lovell, the successful application of associationism hinged on the precise use of reward and punishment. So raisins were often used by treats, as we've seen. Honora also did this. And this was done so that children would associate learning with pleasure, and then the treats would gradually be withdrawn as learning became its own incentive. And punishments would be used in the same way to associate pain with disobedience, for example. Just a reminder, so this is this is like 1787, no, 1780. So this is quite a long time before practical education, and as the title suggests, really, and as Susan was saying before, that kind of observation of the children drove that, and so it becomes less concerned with pushing a particular theory. So this is something that kind of evolves later on. This is earlier on, where the theory of association really is quite important, at least to Richard Lovell Edgeworth. But it's not clear that Honora was similarly persuaded by the doctrine of association. She was reading Hartley's theory around the time she was observing the children. And in her note, she cites a section of the book on the senses of taste and smell, and she questions what Hartley says about the force of the imagination in connection with those senses. But most interestingly, she cross-references Hartley with her own experience, commenting that a paragraph of his on the development of language is illustrated by what she calls the practice of children, naming previously unknown things according to their likeness with known things. But overall, Honora really seems to have taken very little from Hartley or Erasmus Darwin, for that matter. She seems to have been much more interested in learning from observation. In practical education, the Edgeworths claim that the chapter of the book on obedience was written from Honora's notes. But the chapter begins by paraphrasing a premise of Richard Lovell's, that, and I quote, obstinacy arises from an association with pain and obedience, and of pleasure with the contrary. So obstinacy arises from a false association. And that actually appears in an incomplete note of Richard Lovell Edgeworth, and that's dated 1780. And it's one half of a written exchange between him and Honora. And the other half, in the other half of this written exchange, Honora explains that their son, little Lovell, was asked to spell some syllables, which he'd begun to do, and then refused to continue. So he just stopped with the lesson, didn't want to go on with it. And rather than giving in to the child, his father had extracted the answer from him with, quote, several honest strokes with a whip. Honora takes this opportunity for reflection, asking, what does obstinacy in children arise from? Is there no danger of making them cowards by beating them? Is it not pain or fear of pain that makes them yield to the person who is stronger than themselves? And that also reminds me of what Maria says about crouching hypocrisy, that might be a response to fear, I think. So Honora questions whether corporal punishment might not cause a child to grow into an aggressive adult or else develop a servile base disposition. In his reply, Richard Lovell Edgeworth explains in associationist terms the origin of Lovell's obstinacy. He says, Lovell had experienced pain in his feet when he was learning to walk and was disinclined to cross a room, even for food. His nurse had forced him to walk only by harsh words and threats, without giving him pleasure when he had done. So, to counter this habit of obstinacy, Richard Lovell continues, the sensation of pain must be joined with disobedience and pleasure with complacence. In further answer to Honora's concerns about cowardice, about Lovell developing cowardice from this fear, he asserts that the child may be made so through fear, and so may he be by giving him sweetmeats if it be done improperly! ! So against such liberality with treats, he stresses the importance of regular and systematised action. So the success of associationist education, quote, depends on the frequency and certainty of the same idea being combined together in the mind, so that one foolish or froward person in a family may frustrate the utmost care and attention of the most enlightened parents. So what you were saying about servants, that seems relevant there. So this is really kind of, I think the picture that's coming through here is quite a kind of mechanistic and methodical approach to education, one where the intention really is to shape children's characters with precision. And the home environment needed to be very closely monitored and controlled. Even so, it's Honora who's been remembered as somewhat strict. The theory of obedience put forward in practical education builds on the notions Richard Lovell presented to Honora, but with significant adjustments. A humanistic concern with tyranny and liberty inflects the treatment of obedience. This is in practical education. So some violence towards the child, some slight pain, it seems kind of inevitable for them. It's an inevitable, although it's a regrettable part of the process of instilling habitual, involuntary submission as a condition for the development of rational and voluntary self-discipline. It should be noted, though, that love and esteem are stated as the most effective and ethical means of securing obedience. Parents who, and I quote, neglect to cultivate the affections of their pupils will never be able to excite them by noble means, to noble ends by noble means. So I think for Maria Edgeworth, unjust parents, like unjust governments, they command over what she called a dominion of fear, from which reason will emancipate itself, and from which yet more certainly revolt. So to finish up, if the project, at least in its early stages, treated the children as subjects to be studied for the acquisition of knowledge of and thereby power over their bodies and minds, Honora's notebooks also betray the limits of authoritarian pedagogy, and they even hint towards the resistance of the child to the demands of the overly strict teacher. In this final example, from her notes, which I've edited to make it easier to read, Honora records a somewhat ironic dialogue between herself and her stepdaughter, Emmeline. Mother: what is filial duty? Emmeline: filial piety. What is filial piety? Filial duty. But what do you understand by filial duty? Filial piety. And what is meant by the words filial piety? I don't know. So it's hard to really tell what was going on here, but I imagine Emmeline delighting in the circularity of her answers. Or was she just being stubborn, perhaps bored by Honora's attempts to impress upon her the obligations of a daughter towards her parents? In the end, though, maybe this is a reminder that the Edgeworth children were not only subjects of, but agents in the experimental science of education. Thank you. Could I just make another comment? I hate that you make it.
Montessori is not being mentioned here. Maybe that's a bad word. Maybe I shouldn't even mention it. But Honora, it seems to me, must have known something about Maria Montessori.
Possibly. What are the dates?
It's somewhere around the 1800s and the Casa Bambini.
I think because Honora died in 1780. So, but the Edgeworths, did they know about?
Somebody must have known, because you're talking about but the fact that they were even into phonetics at that stage.
Yeah.
You know, I'm fascinated by it, because that was one of Montessori's writing a little thing to do, to go to the press and make out a children or a pet. And so Montessori used that. So when I hear you're saying Honora was doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, it's very, very interesting, because actually what you see is like the coincidence of similar ideas all over the place. So I mentioned Piaget before. Yes. There's a definite, I think that what this shows is that actually there is, because this is an observational science, it has got a basis in children's actual behaviours and the way they actually learn. And so, of course, you're going to see a lot of the same.
In bridges. Yeah.
It's an isolation.
No, yeah.
It's a huge movement that is going on from America to Dewey to Montessori to Pestalozzi to Piaget to Bradford. And you know that somewhere I read that Martin Luther even was recommending the education for the masses.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know about the one about the Bible, and they only had it in somewhere, they only had it in Latin, and it wasn't allowed to go into English because the Bible laws they gave to read it.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned briefly what I think can be considered the failed experiment of the oldest son, Richard. I just wondered how much you think that might have stimulated their subsequent interest in their own children in not wanting to make the same mistake.
I think it definitely did, especially because Honor is just married into the family, and now she has stepchildren to look after, including Mariah, who I think was quite unruly. Yeah, and a little unruly because she was so unhappy. And so yes, I think, and she will have wanted to take control and do things her own way as well. But as well as Richard or Dick Edgeworth, his kind of Rousseauian education, there's also, of course, Thomas Day and his dreadful experiment with Sabrina Sidney and Lucretia, two foundling girls. I don't know if you all know this, but who he adopted in order to train them to be an ideal wife for himself. So I think there is a definite reaction against the kind of Rousseau's model. And Rousseau never intended, it's worth saying that he never actually intended it to be put into... No, and it was just a kind of idea, and then he ran with it.
Again, just a comment. It's amazing how the lessons resonate down through the years. So domination by fear and love and respect, we all struggle with that in our daily lives, and our society, and even Putin invading Ukraine, domination by fear. And thankfully, corporal punishment's gone out of the education system, and certainly when I was young, instead of domination by fear. But love and respect, a great word, it's something we should all use in our everyday lives. Exceptional. You know? Thank you. Thank you.